When the global food crisis hit in 2008, over 30 countries erupted in hunger riots, governments collapsed, and hundreds of millions of people faced starvation. At that time, the United States, controlling the global soybean supply chain, single-handedly stabilized the world's protein supply, demonstrating the terrifying power of agricultural dominance. But here's the reality. Every fluctuation in global soybean trade can change what hundreds of millions of people eat for dinner and instantly reverse the fortunes of tens of millions of farmers. What's even more shocking is that the American soybean empire, which once ruled the global market with a 75% export share, has now seen its market share plummet to just 20%. And in this latest trade war of 2025, China's retaliatory tariff on American soybeans has reached a staggering 94%, essentially announcing the end of an era. What happened behind the scenes? Why did the once unshakable American soybean dominance crumble in just a few short years? 25 years ago, American soybeans were like the iPhone of today, practically irreplaceable. In the global soybean export market, American farmers controlled an astounding 75% market share, shipping 43 million tons of these golden beans to every corner of the world each year. Megan Kaiser, a farmer from Missouri, still remembers that golden age. Her family's farm stretches along the Missouri River, where 5 generations have worked the land, rotating corn and soybeans. Back then, growing soybeans was like printing money, Kaiser recalls. We'd plant in April, harvest in September, and orders from China just kept rolling in. The numbers tell the story of American soybean dominance even better. In 2017, the United States led the world in soybean trade, with annual exports valued at over $22 billion. More critically, China, the world's largest soybean consumer, imported a whopping 32 million tons of soybeans from the United States each year, accounting for 35% of its total imports. This dependency seemed unbreakable, until that spring of 2018 that changed everything. In April 2018, when the first round of tariff lists was announced, soybeans were right there on it. For American farmers, this was like a bolt from the blue. No one expected that this cash cow, which had fed millions of American farmers, would suddenly become collateral damage in a trade war. The market's reaction was more brutal than anyone imagined. On the morning the tariff news broke, soybean prices at the Chicago Board of Trade plunged 40 cents in a single day, a drop of over 4%. What did this mean? For a farmer like Kaiser with 1,000 acres of soybeans, they lost over $20,000 in expected income in just one day. The more devastating blow came later. That fall, during the American soybean harvest season, usually a time when Chinese purchase orders would keep the ports running at full capacity. But in 2018, American farmers watched helplessly as their soybeans piled up like mountains with no buyers in sight. Agricultural data shows that U.S. soybean exports to China plummeted 74% in 2018, dropping from 16.3 million tons the previous year to just 4.2 million tons. Behind these numbers lie the shattered dreams of countless farming families like Kaiser's. Caleb Ragland, president of the American Soybean Association, said in despair at the time, "We're facing unprecedented financial pressure, and if this continues, many farmers may never recover." However, while American farmers struggled in pain, no one noticed that on the other side of the globe, Brazilian farmers were showing smiles they hadn't worn in years. Opportunity always favors the prepared, and Brazil had been preparing for this historic moment for a full 30 years. When the American soybean empire took a heavy hit in 2018, Brazilian farmer José Antonio stood on his farm in Mato Grosso state, gazing at his seemingly endless soybean fields, his face full of incredulous excitement. 30 years! We finally waited for this day, the 60-something farmer reflected with emotion. Since the 1990s, Brazil had been quietly building its soybean industry but had always lived in America's shadow. No one expected that the 2018 trade turmoil would become the turning point for Brazil's soybean industry. The opportunity came so suddenly, yet Brazil's preparation was remarkably thorough. Back in the early 2000s, while American farmers were still basking in their monopoly profits, the Brazilian government launched an ambitious agricultural modernization plan. They invested heavily in upgrading port facilities, building rail networks from the interior to the coast, and vigorously promoting genetically modified technology. Numbers best illustrate Brazil's explosive growth. In 2018, the very year U.S. soybean exports were blocked, Brazilian soybean exports surged to 83 million tons, surpassing the United States for the first time. What's even more shocking is that Brazilian soybean production costs were a full 15% lower than America's. Where did this cost advantage come from? The answer lies in Brazil's unique geographic and economic conditions. First, there's the currency advantage. The depreciation of the Brazilian real against the dollar increased export income priced in dollars while reducing production costs calculated in local currency. Second, there's the economy of scale. Brazilian farms often span tens of thousands of acres with extremely high mechanization, naturally lowering unit production costs. But what really set Brazil apart was their precise grasp of the Chinese market. In 2019, while American farmers were still desperately waiting for the trade war to end, Brazil had already signed multiple long-term supply agreements with China. Data shows that in 2019, Brazilian soybean exports to China reached 66.08 million tons, accounting for 65% of China's total soybean imports, while America's share fell to less than 20%. Technological innovation was Brazil's secret weapon. On farms in Mato Grosso state, GPS-guided seeders precisely control the spacing of every seed. Drones monitor crop growth, and smart irrigation systems automatically adjust water levels based on soil moisture. The widespread adoption of these technologies increased Brazilian soybean yields by 30% in just 10 years. The logistics revolution was equally crucial. The Brazilian government invested tens of billions of dollars upgrading port facilities, doubling soybean loading efficiency at Santos Port. Transportation time from Mato Grosso farms to Santos Port was cut from 10 days to 5 days. This efficiency improvement directly translated into cost advantages, making Brazilian soybeans more competitive in international markets. In 2021, the historic moment finally arrived. Brazilian soybean production reached 144 million tons, not only surpassing the United States to become the world's largest producer, but more importantly, Brazilian soybean exports accounted for 48% of global trade share, while America's share had shrunk to 34%. The once unshakable American soybean dominance was completely overturned in just 3 years. However, just as Brazilian farmers were immersed in their victory, a new storm was quietly brewing across the Pacific in early 20. This time, the severity of the tariffs would far exceed everyone's imagination. On an ordinary workday in February 2025, Tom Wilson, a farmer from Illinois, received a news alert that was speechless for a long time. What did this number mean? He quickly calculated. If American soybeans had an FOB price of $400 per ton with a 94% tariff added, Chinese buyers would need to pay $776 per ton to buy American soybeans. Meanwhile, Brazilian soybeans were priced at only $380 to $400 per ton. It's an astronomical difference, Wilson said with a bitter smile. No rational buyer would choose American soybeans. The numbers were even more brutal than expected. Customs data showed that in March 2025, China's soybean imports plummeted to 3.5 million tons, the lowest level since 2000. Even more shocking was the dramatic change in import structure. During January and February, China imported only 9.13 million tons of soybeans from the United States. And although that represented an 84.1% year-over-year increase, it was mainly because the tariffs hadn't fully taken effect yet at the beginning of the year. Meanwhile, imports from Brazil plunged 48.4% to 3.59 million tons. Behind this seemingly contradictory data lay a stunning fact. China was restructuring its soybean supply chain. With the 94% tariff barrier erected, Chinese companies began frantically stockpiling inventory, both to prepare for potential supply disruptions and to snap up the last batch of relatively cheap American soybeans before tariffs fully kicked in. Across the ocean on American farms, anxiety during the spring planting season was unprecedented. Wilson stood at the edge of his 3,000-acre farmland, facing a painful choice. Should he continue planting soybeans, risking potential losses, or switch to other crops, completely abandoning this main business his family had operated for 40 years? Department of Agriculture data provided a brutal answer. Based on current soybean prices and production costs, American farmers would lose $1.5 per bushel of soybeans. For a mid-sized farm like Wilson's, annual losses could exceed $150,000. Worse still, banks began tightening loans for soybean farming. Without stable sales prospects, it's very difficult for us to approve new agricultural loans, admitted a loan officer at an Illinois agricultural bank. This meant that even farmers who still wanted America at an alarming rate. Changes in transportation costs were equally revealing. Shipping costs from Brazil to China Meanwhile, the US to China route saw unit transportation costs rise 15% due to sharply reduced cargo volume. This dynamic further widened the competitive gap between the two countries' soybeans. The American Soybean Association predicted that if the 94% tariff persisted for a year, US soybean exports would decrease by 10 to 15 million tons, with direct economic losses exceeding $5 billion. But the deeper impact was yet to come. Once China fully adapted to a supply chain without American soybeans, even if tariffs were lifted, American soybeans would find it very difficult to reclaim their lost market share. Just when everyone thought this tariff war had settled into its final form, a more complex new landscape was quietly taking shape. The rise of emerging markets like India and Southeast Asia was adding new variables to this game. In August 2025, just as the American soybean industry was sinking into its deepest despair, an unexpected opportunity emerged. The Indian government announced that to meet rapidly growing domestic meat consumption demand, it would significantly increase soybean import quotas, with expected annual imports rising from 3 million tons to 8 million tons. This news gave American farmers a glimmer of hope. India has a population of 1.4 billion, and as its economy develops and middle class expands, demand for protein is growing rapidly. More importantly, India hadn't imposed special tariffs on American soybeans, meaning US soybeans remained competitive in the Indian market. Wilson received his first inquiry call from an Indian buyer. Although the price couldn't match what the Chinese market once offered, it could at least cover production costs. It's not the best option, but at least it gives us a chance to survive, Wilson said with relief. Data shows that in the second half of 2025, US soybean exports to India increased 140%, and exports to Southeast Asian countries also grew 85%. While the overall demand from these emerging markets couldn't fully compensate for the loss of the Chinese market, they at least provided breathing room for the American soybean industry. However, the real change lay in the reshuffling on the supply side. Argentina seized the opportunity to significantly expand its soybean planting area, with 2025 production expected to reach 55 million tons, an 18% increase from the previous year. Ukraine was also actively positioning itself in the soybean industry, planning to double production to 8 million tons by 2020. The global soybean production landscape was evolving from a US-Brazil binary opposition to multipolar competition. Technological innovation became the decisive factor in this new competition. American agricultural technology companies began shifting their focus to increasing yields and reducing costs. New varieties of soybeans cultivated through gene editing technology could increase production by 15% on the same land while reducing fertilizer use by 25%. This technological advantage could be key to American soybeans regaining competitiveness. Brazil wasn't standing still either. They were heavily investing in sustainable agriculture technology, including carbon-neutral farming and biodiversity protection. This not only catered to European market demands for environmental protection, but also earned Brazilian soybeans higher price premiums. The restructuring of transportation networks was equally noteworthy. As Arctic shipping routes became more navigable due to climate change, new routes from Brazil to Asia cut transportation time by 50%. Meanwhile, the United States was considering a new canal project from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific to reduce logistics costs to Asian markets. China's strategy was also undergoing subtle changes. While maintaining high tariffs on American soybeans, China began increasing investment in soybean production in other countries. Chinese companies could be seen investing in farms and processing facilities in Brazil, Argentina, Russia, and other nations. This going-out strategy ensured China's dominant position in the global soybean supply chain. A deeper change involved the transfer of pricing power. For the past 50 years, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange had been the barometer for global soybean prices. But now, Brazil's São Paulo Exchange and China's Dalian Commodity Exchange were growing increasingly influential. The pricing center for global soybean trade was shifting from the single Chicago model to a diversified pricing system. Climate change was also reshaping the soybean planting map. Traditional non-soybean growing areas like North Dakota were becoming suitable for soybean cultivation as temperatures rose, with planting areas rapidly expanding. Meanwhile, traditional southern growing regions faced challenges due to increasingly frequent extreme weather. This northward migration of planting areas could change the overall layout of America's soybean industry. When an agricultural empire's dominance begins to loosen, the entire world's food landscape restructures along with it. The fall of American soybeans from 75% market share to 25% isn't just a change in numbers. It's a true reflection of great power competition in the era of globalization. The 94% tariff isn't an endpoint but the beginning of a new era. In this multipolar agricultural new world, there are no permanent hegemonies, only an increasingly diverse and resilient global food system. When the next food crisis arrives, the world will discover that a decentralized supply chain protects human survival security better than monopolistic dominance ever could.